Hi, Misha here, and I'm going to be doing a series of videos for the week of, well, all these holidays. Christmas, New Year's, Kwanzaa, if you will, Hanukkah, whatever. Life Day, if you were victimized by that thing that existed once. And I have a couple of purposes. Each video is going to talk about either a specific type of gun or a group of early guns. When I started my collection, really, I started collecting seriously about 20 years ago, around this time of year. In fact, Christmas makes me think of firearms, in particular, the subject of today's video, the German Walther, or Walther, if you prefer, PPK. So I'll explain that. So there's going to be a little bit of story time here. And in video 2, we're going to look at how I got into block guns. And we'll go into how I got into bolt actions and some more modern-ish guns like the FAL in subsequent videos. So I'm going to be able to give you quite a few videos. People are going to be home for the holidays, so I want to give you something to look at and check out. And we will be going to the range. Actually, probably while you're watching this video, we'll be shooting. So I will have some new shooting footage to introduce 2022 with. And speaking of 2022, it's kind of the purpose of this video. This is a bit of a awareness raiser, a fundraiser, if you will, for Patreon, and just generally speaking that I would be lying if I said it was not difficult to keep going this year by myself. But still here and still planning to be here next year. And in fact, I want to expand the channel. I want to bring in some third parties to spiff things up a bit. Nothing crazy, but just a little bit here. Also, I want to get some money together to maybe start traveling a bit, either to do collab videos or maybe go to museums. But yeah, that costs. And the Patreon supporters have been great, just helping pay for ammo, gasoline, getting the GoPro last year. So absolutely would not be able to do it without them. But I want to raise awareness. So in every video, there's a link to the Patreon page, and there's a tier system. And I may continue to tinker with it now that it's just me here. But I wanted to do a series of videos really talking about when I started as an adult getting into guns. Now, I say it like that because I shot guns in the 80s and 90s when I was a kid and very young man. But it was around 2001 that I got into collecting guns, and really my tastes were established. And with that, let's talk about how the Walther PPK really was the first handgun I ever bought for myself, by myself. These are the 4 that I own, and probably won't be a lot of changes. This is a standard 1930s production model. It's not the early 90-degree safety. I have had those before, but this is my Dural frame, lightweight version. Actually, one I'm very happy to have. It was made around 1943, maybe 44 during the war. And then we get to the post-war period. We have the Herein, made in France under license in the 1950s through the 1980s. And then, of course, we wrap up with something that's not truly a PPKS because it was made to comply with goofy laws post-1968. Still, if you wanted a French or a West German-made PPK type gun, you had to get the PPKS here. You can still get the PP, but yeah. So these kind of represent different eras and styles. And actually, my first one was a 1930s, 1940s Nazi, or Nazi, if you're Winston Churchill, era gun. Oh, and also, I will be doing an extended version of this video with more rambling and sidetracking for Patreons. I try to do longer versions for Patreons. And I will even be doing a special black box video on my personal Misha channel talking more about getting into guns. basically, it's just, this is me. This is who I am. People see the guns I have and they think things, but, the longest journeys start with a couple of steps, and for me in guns, it was absolutely no different. And in the beginning, I knew absolutely nothing to speak of. And it was really just luck of the draw that over the Christmas break of 2001, I got the wild hair up my butt to get a PPK. Now in the USA, you have to be 21 or older to buy a handgun, so I was only just over that age by a year or so. So I got the wild hair to do it during the break and ended up taking about a 3.5 hour road trip on no sleep. Well, I wasn't doing the driving, hopefully. And I picked it up at a shop in Little Rock, our state capital, because a friend had seen it down there. And he had asked me, which PPK do you want? Which Walther? French made, American, German? I really didn't know the difference. But I said German just because I knew German quality. Now this isn't that gun. That gun's long gone. Because I was so new, it turned out it had been reblued, something I would have recognized immediately later in life. But, I didn't know what I was looking for. So, and back then, when I first bought it, I literally treated it with kid gloves. I usually wore leather gloves, or at least white gloves, while handling it. I was very, very delicate with it. I didn't really know what guns could and couldn't be. And again, more on that on the Patreon edition of this video. Now, of course, I've talked about the PPK before, but there's always more history to add. Here is a standard PP, Paulaz pistol, police pistol. And this was actually quite a revolutionary gun when Walther introduced it in 1929. Now, in the USA in the 20s and 30s, the police really preferred revolvers and larger bullets, 45, 38. But in Europe, where they had smaller areas, more urban areas, the police preferred automatics and, smaller cartridges. It's just what they wanted. But at that time, there really wasn't an in-between like this. This is about 6 3/4 inches long, weighs about 23 ounces, and has a barrel about 3 3/4. Most of your guns were either full-size, like, say, a Luger or a 1911, or they were small vest pocket types. What Walther introduced here was a gun that split the difference. And keep in mind, this was introduced in 7.65 Browning, 32 auto. That was considered reasonably powerful for a police gun at that time. Size-wise, it's alright. 8-round mag. Now this mag release, this Browning style, was actually pretty different. That wasn't really used by much. It also had a last round holdback, but no release control. So I'm going to pop the mag out. And here we have the main feature of this. A double single action trigger. It was the first production gun to have this. Now this is a simple blowback gun. The barrel essentially acts as the recoil guide. But it also has this new safety system that made it one of the first guns that was really safe to carry with one in the pipe. Put it down, trigger's blocked, and if you take it off, you still have that first long pull to make safe. So that was introduced in 29 for police and some military use and civilian. But in 1930, Walther started working on our PPK, Police Pistol Criminal, otherwise detective. They took the same basic gun, same trigger system. They shortened the barrel to about 3 1/4 inches. They shortened the grip and the magazine to hold 7 in 32 instead of 8. They also did away with the back strap. So this has a metal back strap here with panels. This has a wraparound strap that actually saves quite a bit of weight and gives you one grip unit. Also, because of the polymer used back then, these are almost always cracked to some extent, especially up here at the top of the web. And so it was a little bit smaller, a little bit lighter, at about 20, 21 ounces. And it had the same features. This was introduced for plainclothes police, security agents, maybe military MPs, high-ranking government officials, high-ranking military officers, and of course for export. And it quickly became popular, building on Walther's reputation. It was purchased by the Luftwaffe. It was purchased by the Heer. This wouldn't be in an enlisted man or even a lieutenant's belt. This would be more of a colonel or a general or a Fuhrer. Yeah. It was a badge. In fact, many of these were given away with special grips and sent them special engraving and finish as ranking Nazi guns, and Walther would make them in large numbers. And originally they were introduced in 7.65, 32, which to me is the original caliber. They would make some in 9mm Kerrs at this time, but it was relatively limited production. They would also do a few in 25, 6.35, and even some in 22, 5.6. And there'd be some other variations and what have you. And production would continue throughout the war, equipping a lots in the military, especially as a backup gun. Like I said, Luftwaffe pilots would sometimes carry these. The Gestapo would carry them, the SS. And unfortunately, some of these were made in concentration camp environments, or at least parts for them were made. Walther did have some production at Walther 2. But it was a well-respected gun on both sides of the war. Small, reliable, and safe to carry. And I just always thought they were a neat gun, even before I really knew about guns. Now, I have found in my life that the 7.65, the 32 caliber versions, work very well. It's actually the 380s, the 9mm Kerrs, that I find sometimes aren't as reliable. I also find that while the 32 versions have okay recoil, I mean, it is a direct blowback gun, so it's going to have a little bit. But I find the 9mm to be sometimes rather harsh and unpleasant. Of course, the 22s are great. Oh, by the way, it also has a loaded chamber pin back here, at least on the 9mm and 32 versions. The 22s don't. But yeah, production would continue, and we would have a few variants done during the war. Even before World War I, a new material was created called dural aluminum, shortened to dural. And in 1935, Walther started using this to make the frames of some PPKs, marking them PPK dural. Now the slide is still steel, but the frame is this dural material. And it really does save 3 to 4 ounces. These are 16 to 17 ounces. It's a very svelte gun. Holding this here versus this one, this is noticeably heavier. They actually tried making P-38 frames out of this material in World War II, but they just couldn't get the mix right where it would be stable enough, durable enough to fire 9mm. But in 32, yeah, it could take the punish. Now 380, but most durals I've seen from the war were 32. It's worth pointing out the frame is a little bit reinforced here. They didn't do the little chamfering here as on the 32 frame. Now they would keep making Dural frames in small batches up through 1942. And they would use up old frames from storage in 1943 and 1944 to kind of make the final PPKs that were delivered for the Nazis. After 44, effectively PPK production was over. PP production would continue, although they would greatly simplify. They would go to wood grips, they would go to a much simpler blued finish, sometimes even phosphate. They would eliminate several machining steps. They would even eliminate the loaded chamber pin. The PPK never received that round of simplifications simply because it was not being produced in 1945. But of course they had made quite a large number, and many had been captured. And for a time we did not have these. Now, you can't talk about World War II and PPKs and not talk about Der Fuhrer. In 1939, for his 50th birthday, Karl Walther presented Adolf with a custom plated, engraved, monikered PP, the full-size version. At some point, Hitler would also pick up at least one standard PPK. He also carried an older Walther Model 8, which several Luftwaffe aircrews also carried too. Hitler had several guns, presentation. Hermann Goering is another famous carrier of a presentation PPK, and many other high-ranking, popular people in Nazi Germany, be they more on the military or political or both sides, would have PPs, PPKs, and what have you. It was certainly a little bit of a prize to get one. While the PP missed out on Hitler's final days, he left it behind in his apartment. He did take the PPK and the Model 8 into the bunker with him, where he went completely apeshit and insane. So at the end, as you know, he shot himself in the head with a PPK, which means the whole world owes the PPK a debt. Yeah, I know, Walther, Nazi country, World War II, yada yada. But yeah, at least they did that. He also bit down on a cyanide pill just to make sure the job was done. At least he did something right. Either way, it's a famous thing known, and several other high-ranking officials were captured with PPKs, and they kind of became very popular trophies with U.S. and even a few British and Russian GIs. But, you know, the Americans could bring guns back home and own them, whereas handguns are pretty frowned upon in many other nations after the war. So a lot of them came over here. But the Walther factory, Zalamelis, ended up being in the Soviet zone of occupation, East Germany. So that didn't work. Instead, Fritz Walther took what documentation he could and would flee to the west and would do his best to start up a new company, eventually landing in the city of Ulm. He had a couple of small stayovers in other towns before, but Ulm's where he really set down roots. I think it was in 1948, 49. And their factory is still there today. But in the beginning, they weren't making guns. In fact, they were making typewriters and adding machines, because after World War II, for some reason, neither the Allies nor the Soviets were keen to let Germany make guns. So they were forbidden in the 1940s. But the Cold War would change things, both on the big scale and for the little Walther PPK too. So, pre-end of World War II on the left, post-war on the right. Walther needed capital, so began talking with companies licensing their products. And in 1952, a deal was struck between Karl Walther, the company, and Herein in France. And in 1953, They were turning out both the PP and PPK. Eventually, they would also do the P38 P1 series, so on and so forth. These were produced under license, and for a time they were the only Walthers being made, but it wouldn't last long. Already, West Germany was being allowed to rearm because of the Soviet Union, and by 1955, the Bundeswehr was reforming. They needed new guns, and eventually Walther would rework their World War II P38, turning it into the P1, which was adopted in 1957. But Herein is still producing PPKs. Now, if you look at the Wartime here, there are a few minor differences, like the cut here is more boxy. The post-war is more rounded off, which makes sense. The sight and the sight rib is a little different. A little different shape here in the back and the front. Rear sight's kind of more that shape here. And they did improve the mixture for the Bakelite grips. These grips were brittle, and so the post-war ones are a little better. They're still Bakelite, at least early on. By the way, they always ship these with either a flush fit or a finger bag. Lanyard bar here. Mechanically, there's not really much difference internally. And they're marked, made in France, Walther Herein, that kind of thing. Now, the relationship between West Germany, Walther, and France, Herein, is interesting. By the 1960s, you will see French marked guns and West German marked guns. But the way European law is written for guns, the country of origin is where the final finishing and proof testing and assembly is done. What would happen, since was busy with the P1 and other things, they would actually have parts from France shipped over, making some themselves in Germany too, but using a lot of French forgings, fitting them together, bluing them, proof testing them, and then producing them out of West Germany. There were also some legal political reasons for this, for like the police departments and what have you. Just depends. So you will see both concurrently, actually for quite a long time throughout the 60s and 70s. Herein wouldn't stop until 1986, and Karl Walther in Germany, well, still officially makes them today in small batches, but really was producing them full speed ahead until about 1991, 1992. I should say that the last few years between Herein and Walther were pretty rocky. The original licensing had run out. Herein kept making them. Walther didn't want them to. It's a thing. You can read about it. They also would expand the line, doing more 380s, more 22s. They even reintroduced the lightweight frame, no longer calling it Dural. In 1964, they introduced the PPK-L for lightweight. But unfortunately, very few were actually allowed in the USA before 1968, which we will get to. Now, these were not just made for the commercial market. Oh, no, no. They had lots of interested parties. While standard rank-and-file military officers were not apt to carry a PP or PPK, many security intelligence services would issue it, at least in some number. The Israeli Mossad famously used it, and the Swiss actually adopted it in the Air Force. They selected the PPK-L for flight crews in 1965, and the standard PPK with the steel frame for ground crews in 1972. The East German Stasi would use some. I'm not sure how many were World War II leftovers and how many were unlicensed copies made at the captured Zalamelis factory. China would make an unlicensed copy. A lot of people made copies of these. It's a simple blowback gun, but it works, and it's respected, and was pretty advanced for its day and time, and just it filled a need for a good defensive gun. In fact, some have called it the most cloned, most copied gun in the world. How many were made officially? Hard to say. 5 million PP and PPK. I've seen the number of about 1.2 million PPKs made post-war total. And so, yeah, production really continued. There's even rumors that the U.S. CIA had some. There's a whole long list of different agencies. Of course, France would. And, of course, you can't talk about the PPK without talking about Bond. James Bond. And I fully admit and confess that that's pretty much where I knew the PPK from when I was looking to buy one 20 years ago. I knew the basics, but that's about it. And funnily enough, the one he carried was probably a manure hen. I say that because the whole reason he had a PPK was a letter that Geoffrey Boothroyd wrote to Ian Fleming in 1956. So really before West German production started in 57, criticizing Bond's Beretta, or Beretta 418, which was a 25 caliber, 7.35. And so, because Fleming corresponded with Boothroyd, he would write out the Beretta in the novel From Russia with Love, where it nearly kills Bond in the novel. Therefore, in the subsequent novel, Dr. No, published in 1958, Major Boothroyd, named in honor of Geoffrey, presented Bond with the PPK in 7.65, 32, and kind of mocked his Beretta a bit in the book and film. Now, interestingly, Boothroyd would evolve into the character we know and love as Q. And, of course, the PPK would evolve into James Bond's iconic gun. Pretty much going from every Bond, from Connery through Brosnan. And it's not the worst choice. I did, laugh in the film when I first heard they said that it shoots a bullet like punching, like throwing a brick through a plate glass window. I mean, I guess, 32. But I guess when you're carrying a 25, 32 does seem potent. Keep in mind, though, for an undercover gun in the late 50s, this is before armor vests and stuff were in common use and all this stuff. So, anyway, it was definitely a better choice than the Beretta. And this really propelled the PPK to superstardom. And if that wasn't enough, another big fan, just as famous as James Bond, was Elvis Presley. Thank you. Thank you very much. He had at least two, probably more. And some were gold-plated and inlaid, some were standard. He just was a fan of the gun. Makes sense. He could afford the best, and this was one of the best handguns of its type in the world in the 1960s and 70s. Presley actually had a pretty big admiration and thing for police and law enforcement. You can look it up. But the 70s, while the popularity of the PPK continued to rise and rise, this is really the end of its effectiveness. It had been carried by a lot of West German police, but then the Munich affair happened in 72, and body armor did start to become a theme. So by 74, 75, 9mm was replacing 32. So its days as a police and security gun were pretty much over, but not its days as a commercial gun and as a sporting gun, that's for sure. Plus, the U.S. had become pretty much the biggest market for the PP and PPK. But in 1968, the government threw a big monkey wrench in all that. On the right, we have the Manurin PPK. On the left, we have the West German PPK S. No one knows 100% what the S stands for. Most say sport or sporting. That makes sense. Because the 1968 Gun Control Act was focused on interstate commerce of firearms and sporting purposes, sporting clause. Anytime you hear all that sporting hullabaloo, it started with the 1968 Gun Control Act. And for imports, to try to prevent quote-unquote Saturday night specials, they set up a points system. A gun needed so many points to be considered sporting and thus legal for import. Weight, size, features, magazine capacity, all of this counted for points. Unfortunately, the PPK just didn't have enough. It was about an ounce too light. It was a little too short by a hair, and it only held 7 rounds in .32 and only 6 in .380. And those were no-nos. And it didn't really have any other features to give it extra points. The safety, that was good, but it didn't have adjustable sights. And it was a little too light, like I said, and yeah, just didn't. So what Walther did very quickly, not wanting to lose a very big market, they took the PP frame, mated it to a PPK short barrel and slide. And that worked to have it eligible for import as early as 1969. With this new configuration, we're about a 1/4 inch taller. We're about 2 ounces, how about that? Heavier. And we now have 8 rounds in the magazine, which is considered sporting. Apparently more bullets is more sporting. I don't really understand the logic there. It also had the feature of a target trigger, i.e. a ribbed trigger for our pleasure. Something you'll see on more Walther guns. This gun's kind of interesting. I picked this up from Century. It was part of their odd lots. They had a bunch of West German police PPs. They couldn't import the PPKs, but they could import the PPs. But they had this one PPKS. So some of these made their way into police use in Europe, but it was primarily for the U.S. market. Pretty much all the PPKSs I see tend to be West German, but I do believe there are some herein marked ones as well. But after 68, you could not import the PPK. That's not to say some didn't come over through alternative channels, let's say, but that was the end of the big deal. And the PPKS would continue on. In fact, in 1978, Ranger Manufacturing would start making the PPK and PPKS in the USA. This was going to be distributed by Interarms, who had been handling the imports for ages, since the 50s. And these are mostly in .380 and mostly, if not always, with a stainless steel finish. If you see a stainless steel PPKS, it's usually a Ranger gun, or later Smith & Wesson. The German guns are either blued or, less common, nickeled. So they would make these for Interarms, and they would be sold alongside imports throughout the 80s. And this arrangement would continue. Like I said, 1991, 92, Herein was already done, and West Germany was wrapping up. Heck, West Germany as a country was wrapping up. Only going to limited production. And there were lots of changes at the Walther factory with the failure of the P88 and P88 compact, and then the launching of the new polymer-framed P99. But that's a story for another day. But the PPK story is absolutely not even over today. In 1998, Smith & Wesson would take over distribution of Walther firearms in the USA from Interarms. And around 2002, they would actually start making PPKs in the USA up in a factory in Maine, I believe it was. And this is the first major revisions for the design. I don't have one to show you, but they essentially gave it a longer beaver tail on the back, and they finally made it compatible with modern hollow points like Winchesters. Before that, these were made for ball ammo because, of course, they were. The design is from the 1930s. And there was a few other manufacturing changes and whatnot, a few safety features added. But Smith & Wesson would produce them up until 2012. This is when Walther USA would be established to handle the Walther brand itself, and that's here in my state of Arkansas, in Fort Smith. They would start marketing in 2013. They would start importing some PPKSs in 22 from Germany. And then, a few years ago, they started making, or at least assembling, PPKs in Fort Smith. Now, like most newer ones, these were in 380, and most are in stainless steel, because this is kind of just a continuation of the old Ranger tooling from the late 70s. But once in a while, they still do blued guns, and they may even do a 32 if they really had to, but they seem to really want to do 380s, which is a shame to me because, like I said, I think it's a better gun in 32, frankly. And I think Walther did as well back in the day. And that's kind of where we're at today. The gun is still being made. Its days as a military gun are over. Its days as a police gun are over. Really, it's not a good option for a modern carry gun. It's 20 ounces, give or take, 6 inches long, and it just holds 6 to 7, maybe 8 rounds if you go to the S style. And we're not talking 9mm or 40 or 45, we're talking 380 or 32. So it was very good for its day and time, but of course, this is 90 years after it was introduced. The fact that it's even still in production today is remarkable, even if it's just for collectible and curiosities. It should be pointed out that, James Bond films kind of took a dive in the 80s, and then we really didn't have films throughout the 90s. So the popularity did go down. But with GoldenEye coming out in, 95? 94, 95? The PPK was in that. There was a bit of a resurgence, plus Smith & Wesson's new marketing, and now Walther USA's marketing. So it's actually bounced back from a bit of a low. It's a boutique gun, but it really was the first handgun that I actively bought myself, paid for, filled out the paperwork on. And even though I don't have that one anymore, because like I said at the beginning, I discovered it was blued. This was my introduction to military police style handguns and just handgun firearm ownership in general. Of course, I bought a couple of guns right around the same time because I'm not really one for half measures. During that Christmas break, I bought a few different guns and would continue throughout 2002 as it would move on. And that's what we'll talk about in the next videos. But hope you enjoyed this one. For a little more personal anecdotes and stories, again, there's an extended version for the Patreons over there. If you'd like to check that out, you can click on the link to the Patreon in the video. We have a $1 and up tier, a $5 and up tier, a $10 and up tier. I'm thinking about adding a dill weed tier. Some of you will get that. And just, sense of community, try to have fun. I try to be responsive, try to pop in every couple of weeks and say hello. But, yeah, I'd like to do some new things, go some new places in 2022, and so kind of pushing this. So any help you can give is much appreciated. And if that's just watching the videos and sharing, listen, that's awesome. I appreciate anything and everything. I don't expect anything, but anything you can do is greatly appreciated, including commenting below. And if you could, do please like, share, and subscribe because, well, YouTube. And again, I hope everyone got their Christmas shopping done. If you didn't, well, I guess it's probably too late now. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon in the next video.